Hi, folks. It's Andy, the Analytical Preacher. As I'd stated in a previous podcast, there are some lively, contentious debates going on around the book of Genesis. In the modern Christian world, these debates have been raging now for at least hundreds of years. And they center around mostly how do we interpret Genesis? Is it to be read as literal history with a linear timeline? Is it more of a symbolic story? To what degree are we to endeavor to understand it as the original audience to whom it was written would have understood it? Or are we to read it as modern individuals with a full knowledge of science? And as I've argued in that previous podcast, how we interpret Genesis is important, and those discussions do need to happen. Those debates do need to continue to be carried out. But the debates have become so dominant that I'm afraid they're now overshadowing some of the lessons that are intended. So, regardless of how you choose to interpret Genesis, there are certain lessons that come, and these are important. The first 12 chapters of Genesis are foundational in underpinning our Christian faith. So you can't really be a New Testament Christian unless you understand, at an absolute minimum, the first 12 chapters of Genesis. So in this podcast, we want to take all those arguments, we want to push them to the side. Again, not saying they're not important, but saying they can't become the all-encompassing aura around Genesis. When we think about Genesis, think about chapter 1 or 2 or 3. We need to think about the lessons that God intends us to take from this word that He inspired and then protected for us for thousands of years, and not let the arguments that become heated, that become human-centered, that become personality-based, not let those unending human arguments distract us. So without taking a side on those arguments in this podcast, I want to look at a few lessons that we would take from the second chapter of Genesis, really regardless of how we choose to interpret that word. Number one, though God gave humans a responsibility to manage His earthly creation, the words He gave to Adam were subdue the earth and have dominion over it. Those are powerful, powerful words. And God is saying, you can tell by some of the verbs in there, like how God created and how His creation was finished. You can tell by those verbs that God had created stuff that couldn't be eliminated or recreated, what we would call the first law of thermodynamics. But within what God had created, the matter and energy that can't be added to or destroyed, God said, go and you be creative. You're made in my image. Subdue it. Have dominion over it. Here's the big sandbox. Go make whatever you want. But though God clearly gives mankind the responsibility for that, God maintained the moral authority. So chapter 2, verse 17, God says, of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, you shall not eat. You are not created to deal with the knowledge of good and evil. You were created to deal with trusting me as your God. You were created to have faith in me as your creator. And if I tell you don't eat from that tree, then you shall not eat from it. And I maintain that moral authority. You don't need a knowledge of good and evil. Of course, we now have that knowledge of good and evil and wish that we could give it back. I know what evil causes in the world. I see the curses that sin bring. I was never intended to know that as someone made in God's image, but to be God's steward and to manage His earthly creation for Him, to subdue it and have dominion over it, to pursue scientific pursuits and other productive pursuits in the name of God for the glory of God, but not to have moral authority. That was to remain with God. And a lesson for us today, of course, is the same. Disobeying God because we don't have the faith to follow what He tells us to do and not to do leads to moral and spiritual death, as it did in Genesis chapter 2. Then we should still desire to build our faith in our Creator such that we have no desire to engage in the things that He tells us, this you shall not do. We get a beautiful lesson from Genesis chapter 2. And again, I think this lesson sometimes gets buried in all the acrimonious debates about how do we interpret this, and you're not really faithful if you don't believe that. And a beautiful lesson is that even after God had created and man had started, Adam had started to fulfill his responsibility as a steward of the earth by, as Genesis 2 tells us, naming all of the animals. So he had begun to sort the earth and name and categorize different species as God's earthly manager, on-site steward. Even after God had created and man had begun his ministry with God, for God, we still see God looking after, being aware of, and giving gifts to people. This is a beautiful lesson, and it's an important and powerful lesson for us. So in verses 20 to 23, we see God providing a helpmate for Adam. And the reason is given because no helper had been found fit for him. And so God says, Adam, let me be active in your life. Let me be active in my creation. Let me provide a helper fit for you so that you can fulfill the ministries that I'm offering. And we would still say today that we see God as being active in our lives, active in his earthly kingdom, active in his churches. And finally, we see at the end of the second chapter of the first book of the Bible, the formation of the biblical family. Some people call it the traditional family, the nuclear family. It is the biblical family. It was the first institution ordained by God, the family, for this reason. A man and woman will leave their mother and father, and they will get married, and they will cling to each other, and it will be as if the two are one flesh. And Jesus tells us, of course, that what God has put together in that way, humans just should not break apart with civil divorce laws and things like that. Marriage, the biblical family, is the first institution ordained by God. It was ordained to structure human society, to provide organization and a foundation for human society. It was the most important institution that God ordained, and it remains the most important institution that God ordained. The family is the most important. The biblical family is the main and most important institution in human society. When and if the biblical traditional family breaks down, human society will suffer. And so as we read that in Genesis 2, we say the creation of the family, the creation of that biblical family is not a plan or a way to address the issue. It is the plan from God. For this reason, a man and a woman that will leave their mother and their fathers, and they will become married, and they will cling to each other, and they will become one flesh. And if they are to have children, they will have children within that traditional biblical marriage union. And that was important enough to come up by the second chapter of the Bible. And it remains, as we see Jesus's words in the Gospels, it remains to this day the most important institution that God has created. And so Christians should seek to obey God through faith, because we see how horrible the knowledge of good and evil actually is. We should believe that God is still active in his creation and in his church and with his people. And we should absolutely support prayerfully and every other way that we can the traditional biblical family God established for us in Genesis chapter 2. Thanks so much for listening. Until next time, this is Andy.